The FBI commander said, "No one can negotiate with those terrorists." Then she convinced 6 armed extremists to surrender in under 4 hours. Dr. Sage Parker sat quietly in the corner of the Crisis Command Center, her notebook balanced on her knee as she observed the tactical briefing with the kind of focused attention that most people reserve for life-or-death situations. At 32 years old, she possessed a calm, analytical demeanor that could only be developed through years of studying human behavior under extreme stress. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her green eyes remained fixed on the tactical displays, showing the Westfield Shopping Center, where 6 armed terrorists held 43 hostages in what had become the most complex crisis situation the FBI had faced in over a decade. The morning sun streamed to the command center windows, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension as tactical teams prepared for what appeared to be an inevitable assault operation. Welcome to those who left a trace, where ordinary people carry the most extraordinary abilities that change the course of history. Before we dive into this incredible story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the power of human connection, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that sometimes words can be more powerful than weapons, hit that subscribe button and join our community of those who understand that the greatest victories often come through understanding rather than force. But Dr. Sage Parker was far from ordinary. For the past 6 years, she had been the FBI's most successful crisis negotiator, a behavioral psychologist whose ability to connect with desperate people had resolved over 47 hostage situations without a single casualty. Her official title was Senior Crisis Intervention Specialist, but among those who knew her work, she was simply called the Whisperer. Someone who could find the humanity in even the most hardened criminals and convince them to choose hope over desperation. What made Sage truly exceptional wasn't just her academic credentials, though her doctorate in behavioral psychology from Stanford and her specialized training in crisis intervention were impressive. It was her ability to understand the psychological dynamics that drove people to extreme actions, and her skill of finding precise words that could break through barriers of fear, anger, and desperation that seemed impenetrable to others. Sage's background had prepared her for this work in ways that traditional law enforcement training never could. Born to a family of therapists and social workers in rural Oregon, she had grown up understanding that every person's actions were driven by underlying needs and emotions that could be identified and addressed if approached with the right combination of empathy and expertise. Her father, Dr. Michael Parker, was a renowned psychiatrist who specialized in treating patients with severe trauma, while her mother, Dr. Sarah Parker, ran a crisis intervention center that helped people navigate the most difficult moments of their lives. Growing up in an environment where understanding human psychology was as natural as breathing, Sage had learned to read emotional states and psychological patterns that most people couldn't perceive. She could identify the subtle indicators that revealed whether someone was genuinely dangerous or simply overwhelmed by circumstances they couldn't control. More importantly, she had developed the ability to communicate in ways that made even hostile individuals feel heard and understood. Sage's introduction to law enforcement had occurred during her graduate studies, when local police needed assistance with a barricaded subject who had been threatening suicide for over 8 hours. Traditional negotiation techniques had failed, and tactical teams were preparing for a forced entry when Sage offered to attempt communication. Within 40 minutes, she had convinced the individual to surrender peacefully, demonstrating skills that impressed veteran crisis negotiators who had been unable to make progress. That success led to additional consultations with law enforcement agencies throughout the Pacific Northwest, where Sage's unique approach to crisis intervention began attracting attention from federal authorities. Her methods incorporated psychological principles that went beyond standard negotiation training, utilizing techniques from therapeutic intervention that could address the root causes of crisis behavior rather than simply managing immediate threats. The FBI had recruited Sage 5 years earlier after she successfully resolved a complex hostage situation involving a domestic terrorist who had taken his entire family captive in a fortified compound. Other negotiators had been unable to establish meaningful communication for over 12 hours, but Sage had identified psychological patterns that allowed her to connect with the individual's underlying motivations and convince him to release his hostages unharmed. Since joining the FBI's crisis response team, Sage had developed a reputation for handling the most difficult cases. Situations where traditional negotiation had failed and where tactical solutions seemed like the only remaining option. Her success rate was unprecedented, but more importantly, she had never lost a hostage or subject during any of her interventions. The Westfield shopping center crisis had begun at 10:47 a.m. when 6 heavily armed individuals had entered the facility during peak shopping hours and taken control of the main concourse area. Initial reports indicated they were members of a domestic extremist group with grievances against the federal government, but their specific demands and motivations remain unclear after 4 hours of attempted communication. Commander Robert Hawk Harrison, the FBI's tactical operations leader, had been managing crisis situations for over 20 years, but the Westfield incident presented challenges that exceeded his previous experience. The terrorists appeared to be well organized and heavily armed, with tactical knowledge that suggested military training. More troubling, they had demonstrated willingness to harm hostages, having already injured 3 individuals during the initial takeover. Harrison commanded respect through demonstrated competence in high-stress situations and had built his reputation on successful tactical operations that protected innocent lives while neutralizing threats. His experience included domestic terrorism cases, international incidents, and complex criminal situations that required precise coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. But Harrison's worldview had been shaped by decades of dealing with situations where force was often the most effective solution to immediate threats. He understood psychology in tactical terms, how to pressure subjects into making mistakes, how to create opportunities for assault teams, how to minimize casualties during forced entry operations. His definition of successful crisis resolution typically involved tactical superiority rather than psychological intervention. Harrison knew Sage existed as a behavioral specialist attached to his team, but to him she was support personnel, valuable for gathering intelligence about subject psychology, but not someone whose input would fundamentally change tactical planning. He had never seen her successfully resolve a situation of this complexity, and wasn't convinced that negotiation could be effective against subjects who appeared committed to violence. Dr. Parker, Commander Harrison called as he reviewed tactical options with his assault team leaders. "What's your assessment of subject psychology based on current intelligence?" Sage looked up from her behavioral analysis notes, having spent the past 4 hours studying everything available about the terrorists and their stated motivations. Her assessment went far beyond surface-level threat evaluation to examine the psychological dynamics that were driving their actions. "Commander, these individuals aren't operating from a position of strength. They're operating from desperation and perceived injustice. Their actions suggest they feel completely powerless in their normal lives and are using the situation to regain a sense of control and significance. The violence they've demonstrated appears to be reactive rather than premeditated, which suggests they can be reached through appropriate psychological intervention." Harrison nodded but continued his tactical planning. "That's useful intelligence, Doctor, but we're dealing with armed subjects who have already demonstrated willingness to harm innocent people. At some point, psychological assessment has to give way to tactical reality. That's when the situation escalated dramatically, transforming what had been a tense standoff into an immediate crisis that would test every assumption about how such situations should be resolved. At 2:34 p.m., surveillance equipment detected explosive devices being positioned throughout the shopping center by the terrorists. Intelligent analysis indicated they had enough explosive material to cause catastrophic structural damage and potentially kill everyone inside the building. The discovery changed the entire tactical equation and created time pressure that eliminated many of Harrison's preferred options. "All units, be advised that subjects have positioned explosive devices throughout the target building," Harrison announced over the tactical radio network. "Bomb disposal teams are en route, but current assessment indicates forced entry operations would likely trigger detonation. We now have a barricaded subject situation with explosive devices and multiple hostages. The presence of explosives made traditional tactical assault extremely dangerous, potentially turning a hostage rescue operation into a mass casualty event. Harrison's assault team could potentially neutralize the terrorists, but not before they could trigger devices that would kill everyone in the building. Dr. Parker, we need to know if these subjects can be talked out of the situation," Harrison said, his tactical certainty beginning to waver as the preferred solutions became unavailable. "Traditional assault options are now off the table due to explosive devices." Negotiation might be our only viable approach. Sage had been studying the psychological profiles of all 6 terrorists, analyzing their backgrounds, stated motivations, and behavioral patterns displayed during the crisis. What she found was more complex than simple extremist ideology. These were individuals who felt abandoned by society and were using the situation to make a statement about their perceived powerlessness. Commander, I believe I can establish meaningful communication with these individuals, but it will require time and a completely different approach than standard negotiation protocols. These aren't hardened terrorists. They're desperate people who feel like they have no other way to be heard. Harrison stared at Sage with the expression of someone who had just been asked to bet everything on an approach he didn't fully understand. In his 20 years of tactical operations, he had relied on force multipliers, tactical superiority, and precise execution. The idea of resolving this crisis through psychological intervention seemed to contradict everything he had learned about managing violent threats. Doctor, we're dealing with subjects who have taken 43 hostages, positioned explosive devices throughout a public building, and already injured innocent people. How do you negotiate with individuals who appear committed to causing maximum casualties? Sage opened her behavioral analysis files and showed Harrison documentation that challenged conventional assumptions about terrorist psychology. Her research revealed patterns of crisis behavior that suggested these individuals were not irredeemably violent, but rather people who had been driven to extreme actions by circumstances they felt unable to control through normal means. Commander, successful crisis intervention requires understanding what these individuals really want. Not their stated political demands, but their underlying psychological needs. They want to feel significant, to have their grievances acknowledged, and to believe that their actions matter. If I can address those psychological needs while providing them with a face-saving way to surrender, they're likely to choose a peaceful resolution. Harrison found himself facing a decision that challenged 20 years of tactical training. Standard protocols suggested that armed subjects with explosives required immediate tactical response. But those same protocols couldn't be implemented without triggering devices that would kill everyone in the building. Doctor, if you can't establish meaningful communication, or these subjects escalate their threats, we'll have no choice but to risk tactical assault despite the explosive devices. How long do you need to attempt negotiation? Give me 4 hours, Commander. If I can't make substantial progress in that time frame, you'll know that tactical intervention is the only remaining option. Harrison made a decision that went against his tactical instincts and 20 years of law enforcement experience. He was going to trust the crisis psychologist with a situation that could result in the largest domestic terrorism casualties in recent history. You have 4 hours, Dr. Parker. But the moment I determine that negotiation has failed, we're going tactical regardless of the explosive devices. Sage immediately began the most challenging crisis intervention of her career, knowing that 43 innocent lives depended on her ability to connect with individuals who felt that violence was their only remaining option for making their voices heard. Her first step was establishing direct communication with the terrorist leader, a 34-year-old former military veteran named David Chun, whose discharge of the army had led to a series of personal and professional failures that culminated in his involvement with extremist ideology. Rather than beginning with demands for surrender, Sage started by acknowledging his grievances and demonstrating genuine interest in understanding his perspective. David, this is Dr. Sage Parker with the FBI. I'm not here to argue with you or tell you that you're wrong about your concerns. I'm here because I want to understand what brought you to this point and what you hope to accomplish today. The approach was completely different from standard negotiation protocols, which typically focus on tactical advantage and incremental concessions. Instead, Sage was treating David as a human being whose actions, however misguided, were driven by legitimate feelings of frustration and powerlessness. David's initial response was hostile and defensive, reflecting expectations that law enforcement would attempt to manipulate or deceive him. But Sage's consistent demonstration of genuine interest in his perspective began to create openings for meaningful dialogue. Over the next 2 hours, Sage gradually built rapport with David and his associates by addressing their underlying psychological needs while slowly introducing alternatives to violence. She acknowledged their grievances without endorsing their methods, validated their feelings without accepting their actions, and demonstrated that peaceful resolution could achieve their goals more effectively than continued violence. The breakthrough came when Sage realized that the terrorists' primary motivation wasn't political ideology, but rather a desperate need to feel that their lives had meaning and that their concerns were being taken seriously by people in authority. By providing them with genuine recognition and promising that their grievances would receive serious attention, she began to undermine their commitment to violence. David, I can see that you and your friends have been ignored and dismissed for too long. What you've done today has definitely gotten everyone's attention. Now the question is whether you want to be remembered as people who hurt innocent families, or as people who were brave enough to stand up for their beliefs and wise enough to choose a path that doesn't destroy other people's lives. The psychological framework Sage employed addressed the terrorists' need for significance while providing them with a narrative that allowed surrender without losing face. Rather than portraying them as criminals who needed to give up, she presented peaceful resolution as the more courageous and meaningful choice. By the end of the third hour, Sage had convinced 4 of the 6 terrorists to consider surrender, but 2 individuals remained committed to violence and continued to threaten detonation of the explosive devices. This required her to shift tactics and address the specific psychological dynamics that were preventing complete resolution. The final phase of negotiation required Sage to identify and address the deeper trauma that was driving the most resistant individuals to embrace violence. Through careful questioning and empathetic listening, she discovered that both men had experienced significant personal losses that made them feel that life had no meaning beyond making a dramatic statement through their actions. Sage's response was to help them find alternative sources of meaning that didn't require harming innocent people. She connected their desire to be remembered with positive legacy options, contrasted the temporary nature of violent fame with the lasting impact of choosing mercy, and gradually helped them understand that their current path would ultimately achieve the opposite of what they really wanted. The crisis ended at 6:23 p.m. when all 6 terrorists agreed to surrender peacefully in exchange for guaranteed psychiatric evaluation, legal representation, and a commitment that their grievances would be reviewed by appropriate authorities. The explosive devices were safely disabled. All hostages were released unharmed, and no shots were fired during the entire resolution process. Commander Harrison watched through surveillance equipment as Sage personally escorted each terrorist from the building, maintaining the rapport she had built during 4 hours of intense psychological intervention. The individuals who had seemed committed to mass violence were walking out peacefully, trusting the promises made by someone who had treated them as human beings rather than monsters. Dr. Parker, what you accomplished today was extraordinary, Harrison said after the final subject had been taken into custody. I've never seen anyone resolve a situation of this complexity through negotiation alone. How did you know that psychological intervention would work when everything suggested these subjects were committed to violence? Sage secured her equipment while conducting the post-incident review that was standard protocol after major crisis interventions. Commander, violent behavior is rarely about actual commitment to violence. It's usually about desperation and feeling like violence is the only way to achieve something important. When you can address those underlying needs through alternative means, most people will choose peaceful options. The FBI's analysis of the Westfield crisis became a classified case study that fundamentally changed how federal agencies approach complex hostage situations. Sage's methods were incorporated into advanced training programs for crisis negotiators throughout the federal law enforcement community, demonstrating that psychological intervention could succeed in scenarios where tactical solutions were unavailable or inadvisable. Commander Harrison was promoted to deputy director and assigned to develop integrated crisis response protocols that combine tactical capabilities with advanced psychological intervention techniques. He never forgot the day he learned that some situations require understanding rather than force, and he ensured that future crisis response teams were trained to recognize when negotiation might succeed where tactics would fail. Sage continued her work with the FBI's crisis response team, but her success at Westfield led to assignments involving international incidents and domestic terrorism cases that challenged the boundaries of what crisis intervention could accomplish. Her approach became the foundation for new protocols that emphasized psychological understanding as the first line of response to complex crisis situations. Today, Dr. Sage, a whisperer, Parker continues to resolve crisis situations that others consider impossible, proving that the most powerful weapon against violence is often the ability to understand why people choose violence and help them find better alternatives. Her work demonstrates that behind every desperate action is a human being who can be reached if approached with the right combination of expertise, empathy, and genuine respect for their humanity. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone else wanted to use force, but you believe that understanding and communication could achieve better results? Sage's story reminds us that the greatest victories often come not from overpowering opposition, but from connecting with the humanity that exists even in the most desperate circumstances. The FBI commander who said no one can negotiate with those terrorists learned that some people possess the rare ability to find common ground even with individuals who seem completely unreachable. Sometimes the most effective response to violence isn't greater violence, but rather the courage to treat desperate people as human beings who can choose a better path if given the opportunity.